The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. I'm so excited to share this book with you guys today. This is one of my all-time favorites. It has totally impacted my life. This book is basically a call to rediscover the majesty of God. So Tozer actually begins this book with an entire chapter called Why We Must Think Rightly About God. And he begins this chapter with a statement that's become one of his most famous quotes. He says this: "What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us." And then he goes on to say this: "The history of mankind will probably show that no people has ever risen above its religion, and man's spiritual history will positively demonstrate that no religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. Worship is pure or base as the worshiper entertains high or low thoughts of God. For this reason, the gravest question before the church is always God himself, and the most portentous fact about any man is not what he at any given time may say or do, but what he in his deep heart conceives God to be like." And then the rest of this book is basically Tozer giving us an introduction to theology proper. Now you're probably asking, what the heck is theology proper? Theology proper is a subset of systematic theology which deals with the character and nature of God himself. So anytime we're discussing any biblical topic, we are doing theology in a sense. But when we start talking about who God is, what God is like, what is his character, what are his attributes, then we have stepped into the specific realm of theology known as theology proper. And this is probably the most important aspect of theology. Because like Tozer said, the most important thing about us is what we believe God is like. So basically each chapter of this book is devoted to an attribute of God. And each chapter is only about 3 to 5 pages long, so he just gives a basic overview of what it means when we talk about the self-sufficiency of God, the love of God, the justice of God, the mercy of God. So this is a great introduction on theology. I would recommend this to every Christian, especially for people who are brand new in the faith. This is a great introduction to understanding who God is. So now let's get into the interesting thought of the book. Let's talk about God's sovereignty. One of the most interesting and yet at the same time probably one of the most philosophically difficult subjects of theology is the sovereignty of God, especially when we start talking about how to reconcile the sovereignty of God with the freedom of man. This is something that I don't think anybody can honestly say they totally understand, but every noted theologian has taken their stab at it. Now, Tozer's position on sovereignty presented in this book is that he believes God has sovereignly decreed that man should be free, and therefore, since the very beginning, man has actually fulfilled that sovereign decree of God by making free moral choices for good or evil. So he says that in that way, man is not actually countering God's sovereignty when he exercises his freedom, but fulfilling God's sovereignty when he exercises his freedom. And that's a pretty fair and respectable Arminian position on the subject. But then he goes on to use an analogy to try and explain this, and he uses the analogy of a cruise liner with people on board. He says the cruise liner has a set destination, and this is supposed to represent the sovereignty of God in the overarching plan of human history. And on this boat, there's people making their own choices, and yet those choices don't impact the destination of the ship. And so he tries to make the connection saying that people can still be free making their decisions, and yet God is still guiding the ship to where he wants it to go. And this, he says, gives a picture of how God's sovereignty and man's freedom can sort of coexist, if you will. Now, the only problem I have with this analogy is that it only attributes God's sovereignty to the big picture of things. But the problem is human history is not like a big boat sailing on the ocean that's unaffected by the decisions of its passengers. Human history is made up of human decisions and human actions that directly impact the course of history. So to say that God is sovereign over the big picture without being involved in our individual choices is impossible. Now, to what extent is God involved in our choices? There, I'm very hesitant to say one way or another. And I think we have to be careful trying to reconcile these two issues, especially when the Bible doesn't do it for us. I am convinced that the exact mechanics of God's sovereignty and man's freedom is beyond us, and to try and explain it is really to tread on untapped springs of divine wisdom. The only thing I do know is that there are multiple examples in the Bible where God's sovereignty and man's choices are mentioned within the same verse, like without any attempt to reconcile the two. It's as if the writers of Scripture just put them there without making any attempt to resolve the tension between them. I, for one, am content to let the tension stand without compromising one or the other. But like I said, this book is seriously a great introduction to building a biblical theology on God. I think it's essential for every Christian library. Now, I know some Christians are turned off by the idea of theology and doctrine because they think it's just this intellectual or academic activity, but that's just not true. Theology is the disciplined attempt to know God and to know Him as He is. And therefore, theology is a worship-inducing and awe-inspiring activity. As we come to know who God is, we should marvel at who He is. And Tozer really exemplified this attitude of being worshipful in our theology, and it comes through so clearly in this book. And if you get this book and it really does stir you and make you more thirsty to know and understand the majesty of God, Tozer actually has a 2-volume set on the attributes of God where he goes much more in depth on the subject. And so I've provided a link in the description box below where you can buy the book on Amazon.com, but definitely The Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer. Get the book.